We'll begin our look into the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is kind of the cleanup crew, so to speak, for the cardiovascular system, as the cardiovascular system is bringing fluids and nutrients to the tissues. It does so at a higher rate than it can pick up those fluids back from the tissues themselves. So there's always some fluid left behind in the interstitial fluid that's there in between all of the cells and the tissues that are out there. And so we pick this back up through the lymphatic system, and we then call it lymph once it's inside there. And that lymph is potentially harboring things like pathological material in terms of bacteria, viruses, parasites. We could also potentially have things like cancer or tumor cells that are there within the lymph. And we want to be able to trap and initiate an immune response as that comes through there. So we're going to cleanse the lymph before we put it back into the cardiovascular system that's there. If we didn't have this, we'd be potentially dumping all of these pathogens potentially back into the cardiovascular system without any kind of concern for it there. And so it would overwhelm the rest of the immune system at that point. The nutrients that are potentially picked up by the digestive tract, and so we can pick up lipids inside the digestive tract here, and those lipids can then be transported through the lymphatic system to get into the bloodstream. When we get excess fluid buildup, and so say we sprained an ankle, or just throughout the day, if our ankles are swelling or our legs are swelling, all of that excess fluid through the night is going to get drained back through the lymphatics and moved back into the cardiovascular system as well, so that retains it back into the cardiovascular system. We can maintain volume levels that are there. And if we should happen to have a situation where we need an immune response to it, we can send signals to bring an immune response into that particular area as well. So the immune response itself that may be directed here is going to be done through the white blood cells. And so those cells themselves are going to potentially produce antibodies. And so remember that our B cells have the ability to produce antibodies. And those are going to bind up all of the foreign material that it comes across, all of the bacteria or virus, whatever it happens to be, or the viral infected cells. And it's going to signal the rest of the immune system to come along. And so that's going to signal a bigger response from those other cells, our T cells, that are going to go out and actively attack and destroy our antigens themselves. And so the antibodies more so just kind of bind them up and hold on to them, whereas our T cells come in and actually destroy them. So that we can remember that infection the next time around, we also have particular memory cells. These memory cells, in addition to having antibodies, are going to help us to remember that, hey, we've seen that particular pathogen before. We don't want to get infected from it again. So it's going to mount a very fast and a very strong response against that same antigen. The lymphatic vessels that we have, and so all of our lymph vessels that are carrying this lymph back to the cardiovascular system, are quite similar to those of veins. And so they have a similar makeup to the veins themselves. And so they have valves in them. They're relatively thin, and so they don't have a whole lot of makeup to them. And although they have valves inside the vessels, they also have little mini valves that allow for the lymph to flow directly into the vessel itself. And so this is going to allow for essentially fluid movement to move from the interstitial space and into the lymph vessel itself. And so it's just going to simply slip through those little mini valves that are there. As the fluid is moving through the actual vessel, then we have the valves on the inside to, just like in the blood vessels, prevent any kind of backflow. We don't want that fluid to get pushing back and back and back within the layers themselves. And so just like with veins, they're also going to need a little bit of help. And so gravity will certainly help with drainage, but that doesn't do us a whole lot of good for our legs and feet and ankles and things. And so with that, we have, once again, the muscular pump, and then we also have the respiratory pump. And so we're going to change those pressures and squeeze that fluid through the vessels until it gets back into the cardiovascular system that's there. The vessels themselves, as they move along, they're going to eventually come across, as they kind of connect back to the body itself, they're going to come across lymph nodes. Here we can see the lymph flow would be going in this direction, and then as it goes through that valve, that fluid then can't get back and make it past the valve wall itself. So it gets trapped into the next segment as it's moving. So that flow, once it's going through the vessels themselves, we want to potentially inspect it at certain times. And that's where the lymph nodes come into play. And so the lymph node is essentially a expansion of the lymph vessel and becomes a filter for things that may be coming into the lymph itself. And we're going to find these at kind of strategic points where the limbs essentially attach back to the torso. And so we have lymph nodes in the inguinal region, we have them in the axillary region, we have them in the cervical region to kind of get those coming back to there. And then we also have them along organ systems that have openings to the outside world. So things like the digestive tract, the respiratory tract, the reproductive tract, and kidneys, as far as the urinary system goes. And so all of that allows us to block things from getting back into the bloodstream so that we don't end up with a blood infection itself. So it moves from, in terms of the flow, it's going to go from very small vessels, and then it's going to go into larger vessels as they move along, and then eventually into trunks, and then into the largest of the vessels, the ducts that are there. And so the lymph nodes are going to be clustered in those areas where we make those connections back to the system itself. And they're going to protect us as we come back into the major regions. And in order to drain the lymph back into the cardiovascular system, we have the thoracic duct, which runs all this entire length here. And then we have the right lymphatic duct, which is relatively short. We'll talk about in just a little bit how the two of them drain different portions of the body. The thoracic duct is relatively large, and it drains into this portion here in between the internal jugular and the subclavian vein, where they have their junction together. And then on the other side, the same thing happens between the internal jugular and the subclavian vein. Both of those come together, and at that junction, our right lymphatic duct will drain into there as well. So I mentioned that the two of them don't drain equally. So the thoracic duct does all of the lighter green here. And so all of the lighter green area of the body is all taken up by the thoracic duct. So everything below the diaphragm, both legs. The right part of the torso is going to be done by the right lymphatic duct. The left side of the torso is going to be done, and the left side of the neck, and the left side of the head, and the left arm are all done by the thoracic duct. Only the right part above the diaphragm, the right head and neck, and then the right arm are drained by the right lymphatic duct. So two completely different drainage processes, in a sense, for the two parts of the body that are there. If the lymphatics themselves start to become backed up, and so if we start to decrease the flow through the system, this is where we may start to get lymphedema. And so this is different from edema from like having a sprained ankle. This is where it's essentially backing up through the system itself. This could be because the lymphatic vessels have been blocked due to things like pregnancy. This can be due to chronic high blood pressure. And so if we're pushing more fluid out than we can get back in. We may have had a reduction in the number of lymphatic vessels. And so after something like a mastectomy, with mastectomy, oftentimes the lymph vessels and the lymph nodes are removed at the same time. And if that happens, then we're going to end up with lymphedema into the arm. And so the arm is going to swell on either that one side or both sides if it's been a double mastectomy. But with heart disease, high blood pressure, we can also see that out in the foot and ankle as well. So the capillaries are the smallest of the vessels. This is basically, they're going to be in and around the capillaries that we have for the cardiovascular system. And they're going to intertwine themselves into those capillary beds as well. Unlike the cardiovascular system, it's not a closed loop. And so the end of the lymphatic vessel, in a sense, is just a closed-ended vessel. And so the vessel, in a sense, is just closed. There's no entrance into it per se. The entrances come from the little mini valves that are placed along the vessel itself. And so it can allow for lymph to flow in, but then it closes off and it doesn't allow the lymph to get out. And so all these little mini valves here are allowing for that fluid to move into it. And this can happen just from simply kind of pushing on the tissues, squeezing the tissues, etc., in and around the tissues themselves. And so it doesn't take a whole lot to get the fluid to flow into it. The cells that we need in the lymphatic system to help out with are going to do things, especially for the cleanup process that's there. And so we have macrophages. And so we're going to have macrophages coming in and destroying any pathogens that may happen to be there within the system itself. We have dendritic cells and lymphocytes. Dendritic cells and lymphocytes are recognizing the antigens that are there as well. The T cells and the B cells of the lymphocytes are both going to be working to destroy any kind of pathogens that are found. And then we have epithelial cells in places like the thymus. And so the thymus is where the T cells are going to get their maturity. That's where they're going to become immunocompetent. And so those are going to be helping in the thymus as well. So T cells and B cells are our functions of the immune system that we have there. T cells mature in the thymus, which is where they get their name from there. And then the B cells mature in the bone marrow. Both of them become immunocompetent. We test those two sets of cells to make sure that they're going to ignore self so that they don't attack our own cells within that. And so we're going to do a process of essentially showing them the self-antigen and making sure that they ignore it. If they don't ignore it, then we're going to destroy those cells. And so we're going to have a positive selection on those. We also have natural killer cells. Natural killer cells essentially don't care who it is. If it's a foreign antigen, whether it be originally from our own body, and so it's a tumor type of a cell, or whether it's from outside of the body, those natural killer cells are going to destroy any kind of foreign antigen that it happens to find. The lymph nodes themselves said that overall we have these lymph nodes that are clustered in different areas of the body, but we also have some kind of, and the lymph nodes are closed, and so they're encapsulated, versus things like the tonsils are open-ended. And so the tonsils are going to have essentially a portion of them open to the outside world, so to speak. Both lymph nodes and tonsils are going to be doing the same thing. They're filtering, looking for antigens, destroy the antigens before they can cause us any kind of infection. So the tonsils are the kind of the gatekeepers for the back of the throat. And so we have pharyngeal tonsils, palatine tonsils, and lingual tonsils kind of rimming the entire back of the throat itself. And so they are looking for anything that is not supposed to be there. They are essentially, as kind of the tissue goes along, we then have our tonsil, and then the epithelial tissue continues on from there. And then inside the tonsil here, any kind of pathogen that might come along can get trapped down into that tonsil, and then we'll get that immune response to destroy whatever happens to be there for those. And so those are positioned in kind of specific areas around the back of the throat there, so that we have all regions. And so we can see the different types of nodules that we can have along the digestive tract here. And so since the tonsils themselves are technically, in a sense, going past the digestive tract as well as part of the respiratory tract there, we do have in the small intestines, we have Peyer's patches. And so we have these collections of lymphatic tissue called mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, or MALT, that are found there. We can then also have little nodules as well. And these are now encapsulated. So we can see the little edge there of the encapsulation itself that is there as well. In addition to the lymph vessels and the tonsils, we then also have our lymph nodes, and we have the spleen and the thymus. The spleen and the thymus being the two larger of the structures that we have, but the lymph nodes and the spleen being the only two that are actively working towards an immune response. So the lymph nodes themselves, when we look at them, we can see that we have a large number of vessels that enter the node. And so these are our afferent vessels. And then we have a limited number, and in this case it's only one, efferent vessels. And so the afferents are incoming, the efferent is outgoing. And so this allows for basically all of that fluid as it's coming in to start to get trapped and slowed down. So it's not going through the lymph node very quickly, and that gives time for all of our immune response, the cells that are there, the T cells, the B cells, our dendritic cells, natural killer cells, all of those cells that are there, they get time to finally inspect and potentially destroy. When we find these lymph nodes, we find them in clusters throughout the entire body. And so those clusters are going to be found in the axillary region, in the inguinal region, they're going to be found in the cervical region, and then also in the lungs and the digestive tract. And so we'll see them in those places there as well. For the blood, we also have a filter as well, and that's the spleen. And so the spleen is our big filter for the blood itself. It's located over on the left side of the abdomen, kind of tucked up underneath the diaphragm. And so it's just below the diaphragm. It's protected by the ribs. And so ribs 9 and 11 are typically in terms of the size of the organ itself. The organ is kind of a deep red to almost a purplish color in terms of its appearance that's there within the abdomen itself there. When we open up the spleen, we find that we have two different portions to it. We have what we call red pulp and we have white pulp. And so the white pulp is involved in the immune response. The red pulp is involved in the destruction of old red blood cells. And so old, dead, dying, defective erythrocytes or red blood cells, as well as platelets, can be found in the red pulp that's there. If the white pulp comes across something that is not supposed to be there, some sort of foreign antigen, it's going to mount an immune response towards anything that should happen to come in. So here we see it here, protected underneath the diaphragm itself, protected by the rib cage, relatively delicate organ that can be damaged simply by trauma that doesn't even necessarily cause outward damage. And so just simply like a car accident can sometimes cause the spleen to rupture. The thymus is an interesting organ. It's found inside the thorax here, and so it's inside the mediastinum. As it sits inside the mediastinum, it's going to grow through childhood. It's going to become larger and larger in children, and as they move into their teen years, kind of makes its peak, and then it starts to change. And then as we get older, it starts to become smaller and smaller and smaller, and it gets filled in by connective tissue, and it eventually essentially atrophies and becomes non-functional as adults. And so the thymus's job is to mature T lymphocytes or T cells. Their job is to get that going. And so early on in life, the thymus is very active because we're coming across new kinds of infections. Our immune system is just budding, it's just starting, and it needs to learn all the different things that we come in contact with. As we age, kind of all of that learning process, all of that processing of the T cells has been done.